In a visiting room at Riverside Correctional Facility, 34-year-old Sarah Mitchell reached across the table to touch her husband's hand. It was supposed to be a simple gesture of love, but within seconds, she collapsed. Her husband, 41-year-old James Mitchell, screamed for help as guards rushed in. Sarah was pronounced dead at the hospital 45 minutes later. James kept repeating the same words over and over. "I told her not to touch me. I warned her. Now she's gone because she wouldn't listen." What nobody could understand that day was why a man would beg his wife not to touch him, and how one innocent touch could end a life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. James and Sarah Mitchell seemed like the kind of couple everyone wanted to be. They met in college, both studying education, both believing they could change the world one student at a time. Sarah became an elementary school teacher who stayed late to help struggling students. James coached high school basketball and mentored kids who had no father figures at home. They had been married for 11 years and had a 9-year-old daughter named Emma. Their neighbors in the suburbs of Portland described them as the perfect family. Always smiling, always helping others, always there at community events. But life has a way of testing even the strongest people. 3 years ago, James lost his teaching position during budget cuts. The bills piled up faster than Sarah's teacher salary could cover. Medical expenses from Emma's unexpected surgery added another crushing layer of debt. James took a job at an auto repair shop working late shifts. He was exhausted and desperate. When an old friend offered him what seemed like easy money to drive a package across state lines, James made the worst decision of his life. He didn't ask what was in the package. He told himself he didn't want to know. The package contained 15 pounds of fentanyl. James was arrested at a routine traffic stop when a drug-sniffing dog alerted officers to his trunk. He was charged with drug trafficking and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Sarah stood by him even though friends told her to leave, even though her parents stopped speaking to her, even though she had to explain to Emma why Daddy couldn't come home. She believed in redemption. She believed love could survive anything. For 2 years, Sarah drove 3 hours every other Saturday to visit James at Riverside Correctional Facility. She brought pictures Emma drew. She told him about parent-teacher conferences and Emma's soccer games. She reassured him that they would be okay, that their family would survive this. James seemed different each time she saw him, more withdrawn, more anxious, more paranoid. He stopped letting her hug him during visits. He flinched when she tried to hold his hand. She thought he was depressed. She thought the isolation was breaking him down. She never imagined the real reason. 6 months before Sarah's death, James started noticing something wrong. Other inmates were collapsing in the yard, overdosing in their cells. The prison was being flooded with fentanyl, smuggled in through letters soaked in the drug, hidden in packages, even brought in by corrupt guards. James had seen men die from accidental exposure. One inmate touched a contaminated letter and hours later was found unconscious in his cell. Another brushed against someone who had been handling the drug and needed 3 doses of Narcan to survive. The prison administration denied there was a crisis. They called it isolated incidents. But everyone inside knew the truth. James became terrified of accidental contamination. He avoided certain areas of the prison. He washed his hands obsessively. He wore long sleeves even in the summer heat. He stopped participating in programs because he didn't want to be near other inmates. When guards searched his cell, he worried their gloves might transfer residue. He couldn't sleep because he kept thinking about how easily the invisible powder could get on his skin, his clothes, his belongings. His cellmate thought he was losing his mind. The prison psychologist said he was developing obsessive-compulsive disorder related to his incarceration trauma. Nobody understood that his fear was completely rational. During a visit 3 weeks before Sarah died, James grabbed her hands before she could touch him. "Sarah, listen to me. You cannot touch me anymore. Not my hands, not my arms, nothing." She looked confused and hurt. "Why are you saying this? Are you giving up on us?" James shook his head, his eyes filled with desperation. "There's something happening in here. Something bad. I can't explain it all, but you have to trust me. Just don't touch me. Please." Sarah promised she would follow his instructions, but in her heart, she thought her husband was having a mental breakdown. She thought he was pushing her away because he couldn't handle the guilt of what he'd put their family through. On a cold Saturday morning in early November, Sarah arrived at Riverside Correctional Facility for what would be her last visit. She had brought Emma's latest report card. All A's. She wanted James to be proud. She wanted to remind him that their daughter was thriving despite everything. She wanted to show him that their family was still worth fighting for. When James walked into the visiting room, he looked exhausted. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. He sat down across from Sarah and immediately said, "Remember what I told you. Don't touch me. Not today. Not ever." Sarah tried to smile. She wanted to be supportive. She wanted to be strong. But she was tired too. Tired of driving 6 hours every other week. Tired of sleeping alone. Tired of being a single parent. Tired of pretending everything would be okay. She looked at her husband, the man she had loved for 14 years, and she felt a wave of frustration. "James, I need you to stop pushing me away. I need you to let me in. Whatever you're going through, we can face it together. But you have to let me help you." James leaned back in his chair. His voice was strained. "You don't understand. This isn't about us. This isn't about my mental state. There's fentanyl everywhere in here. Inmates are dying. I might have been exposed. I don't know. I can't risk it." Sarah's frustration turned to anger. "You're being paranoid. The prison would tell us if there was a real problem. You're inventing reasons to shut me out." James slammed his hand on the table, causing other visitors to look over. "I'm not making this up. 3 men died last month. The administration is covering it up. I'm trying to protect you." Sarah didn't believe him. She thought he was creating excuses. She thought he was abandoning their marriage emotionally because he couldn't face what he'd done to their lives. She stood up and walked around the table. James stood up too, backing away. "Sarah, don't. Please." But Sarah reached out and grabbed his arm. She wanted to force him to feel their connection. She wanted to remind him that their love was real and physical and worth fighting for. The moment her skin touched his sleeve, James jerked away violently. But it was too late. Sarah felt a tingling sensation in her fingers. Then her arm went numb. She looked down at her hand, confused. "James." "What?" That's all she managed to say before her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, her body convulsing. Guards rushed over, visitors screamed. James dropped to his knees beside his wife, not touching her, just watching in horror as medics performed CPR. He kept saying, I told her not to touch me. I warned her." An ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. Sarah was transported to County General Hospital. James was escorted back to his cell. He sat on his bunk, staring at the wall, knowing his wife was dying because he had been exposed to something that should never exist inside a prison. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save Sarah's life. Her heart had stopped. They administered Narcan, thinking it might be an opioid overdose. They shocked her with defibrillators. They pumped her with adrenaline. Nothing worked. 45 minutes after she collapsed in the visiting room, Sarah Mitchell was pronounced dead. The cause of death was initially listed as sudden cardiac arrest, but when toxicology reports came back 3 days later, traces of fentanyl were found in her system, not enough to indicate she had used drugs, but enough to suggest she had been exposed to a lethal dose through skin contact. The prison launched an internal investigation. They tested James's clothing and found fentanyl residue on his shirt sleeves. They tested his cell and found contamination on his bunk, his desk, his personal belongings. The source was eventually traced to a letter James had received 2 weeks earlier. The paper had been soaked in liquid fentanyl, dried, and sent through the mail. James had touched the letter, read it, and stored it in his locker, without realizing it was contaminated. For 2 weeks, he had been unknowingly spreading microscopic amounts of the drug to everything he touched. Sarah's family was devastated. Her parents, who had already cut contact because of James's conviction, refused to attend the investigation hearings. They didn't want to hear explanations. They didn't want to understand how this happened. They just wanted their daughter back. Sarah's sister, Rebecca, became the family spokesperson. She demanded answers from the prison. She contacted lawyers. She reached out to local news stations. She wanted the world to know that her sister had died because a correctional facility failed to protect visitors from a contamination crisis they knew existed. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emma, who was only 9 years old, couldn't comprehend what had happened. One day her mother was alive, planning her 10th birthday party. The next day, her mother was gone. Emma's therapist said she was experiencing traumatic grief complicated by the fact that her father was in prison and couldn't attend the funeral. Emma wrote letters to her father, asking why Mommy had to die. James wrote back, trying to explain, "But how do you tell a 9-year-old that her mother died because she touched you? How do you explain that love itself became a weapon?" The medical examiner's report confirmed that Sarah died from accidental fentanyl exposure. The amount that transferred from James's clothing to her skin was minuscule. But fentanyl is so potent that even a tiny dose can be lethal. The report noted that if Sarah had not had a pre-existing heart condition that she didn't know about, she might have survived. But the combination of trace fentanyl exposure and an undiagnosed cardiac arrhythmia created a perfect storm. James wasn't charged with any crime. Legally, he was a victim too. But in his mind, he was guilty of killing his wife. Prison officials released a statement saying they were deeply saddened by the tragedy. They claimed they had protocols in place to prevent drug smuggling but acknowledged that fentanyl was difficult to detect. They promised to implement new screening procedures for mail. They promised to provide better training for staff. They promised to install body scanners for all incoming inmates and visitors. But none of those promises could bring Sarah back. None of those promises could erase the fact that they had allowed a deadly substance to circulate freely inside their facility while publicly denying there was a problem. Rebecca filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Department of Corrections. She argued that the prison administration knew about the fentanyl crisis and chose to cover it up rather than address it. She presented evidence that at least 7 inmates had died from overdoses in the previous year. She showed internal memos where prison officials discussed the contamination problem but decided not to alert visitors or implement emergency protocols because they were worried about bad publicity. She presented testimony from former guards who said they were told to downplay incidents and discourage inmates from reporting exposure. The lawsuit revealed that James had filed multiple complaints about the contamination problem. He had written to the warden. He had spoken to the prison psychologist. He had even contacted the Department of Corrections ombudsman. Every time, he was told he was overreacting. Every time, he was dismissed as paranoid. Every time, his concerns were ignored. If someone had listened to James, Sarah might still be alive. If the prison had acted on the warnings they were receiving from multiple sources, proper decontamination procedures could have been put in place. Visitors could have been warned. James could have been isolated and tested. The case attracted national attention. Journalists investigated and found that Riverside Correctional Facility was not an isolated problem. Fentanyl contamination was occurring in prisons across the country. Inmates were dying. Staff members were being exposed. And in at least 3 other documented cases, visitors had been hospitalized after contact with contaminated inmates. The opioid crisis that was killing thousands in communities outside prison walls had found its way inside, creating a hidden epidemic that correctional facilities were unprepared to handle. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Rebecca sat in the courtroom every day, listening to testimony about how her sister died. She heard from toxicologists who explained how easily fentanyl could transfer from surface to skin. She heard from corrections experts who testified about the systemic failures that allowed drugs to flood into the prison. She heard from inmates who described the terror of not knowing if the person next to you in the cafeteria had been exposed. She heard from James, who testified via video from prison, breaking down as he described watching his wife collapse and knowing it was his fault. The jury found the Department of Corrections negligent. They awarded Rebecca and Emma $3.2 million in damages. The verdict stated that the prison administration had shown deliberate indifference to a known danger. They had failed to protect visitors. They had failed to implement basic safety protocols. They had prioritized public relations over public safety. The judge who presided over the case said in his ruling that Sarah Mitchell's death was entirely preventable and represented a catastrophic failure of the correctional system's duty of care. If this part is making sense, drop a comment with "I am still here." Let us see who is following this story closely. But money doesn't bring people back. Emma will grow up without her mother. She will graduate high school without her mother in the audience. She will get married without her mother helping her choose a dress. She will have children without her mother there to give advice. Every milestone in Emma's life will be marked by an absence that can never be filled. Rebecca became Emma's legal guardian because James was still serving his sentence. She moved Emma into her home and tried to create stability. But Emma had nightmares. She was afraid to touch people. She developed anxiety around physical contact because, in her mind, touching someone you love could kill them. James requested a transfer to a different facility after Sarah's death. He couldn't stay at Riverside. Every time he walked through the visiting room, he saw his wife collapsing. Every time he looked at his hands, he saw the invisible poison that killed her. He was granted a transfer to a medium-security prison 3 states away. He stopped receiving visits because he couldn't bear to put anyone else at risk. He stopped writing letters because he was afraid the paper itself might be contaminated. He isolated himself completely. In his new prison, James spent his days in the library reading everything he could find about fentanyl, addiction, and the opioid crisis. He wanted to understand how something so small could be so deadly. He wanted to understand how the system had failed so catastrophically. He started writing articles about his experience, sending them to newspapers and advocacy groups. Some published his work. He became an unlikely voice in the conversation about prison safety and drug policy. He testified before state legislative committees about the need for better screening and decontamination procedures. He spoke at conferences via video call about the hidden dangers inside correctional facilities. But no amount of advocacy could change what happened to Sarah. No amount of awareness could bring her back. James carried the guilt every single day. He thought about the moment she reached for him. He thought about how he tried to warn her. He thought about how if he had just refused to come to the visiting room that day, she would still be alive. Other inmates told him it wasn't his fault. Prison psychologists told him he was a victim of circumstance. But James knew that if he hadn't gotten involved with drug trafficking in the first place, he never would have been in prison. Sarah never would have been in that visiting room. Their daughter would still have her mother. 3 years after Sarah's death, James was released on parole. He had served 5 years of his 8-year sentence. The parole board noted his exemplary behavior, his advocacy work, and the unusual circumstances of his wife's death as factors in their decision. When James walked out of prison, Rebecca was waiting for him, not to welcome him home, but to tell him he would never see Emma again. Rebecca had legal custody, and she believed Emma needed to move on without the constant reminder of what her father had caused. James didn't fight her. He thought maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe Emma would be better off without him. James moved into a halfway house and got a job at a warehouse. He attended mandatory parole meetings and stayed away from anyone associated with his past crimes. He lived alone. He didn't date. He didn't make friends. He spent his free time volunteering with organizations that help families affected by the criminal justice system. He spoke at schools, warning teenagers about the consequences of one bad decision. He told his story over and over, hoping that someone might learn from his mistakes, hoping that Sarah's death might prevent someone else from making the same choices he did. On what would have been their 16th wedding anniversary, James went to Sarah's grave. He hadn't been allowed to attend her funeral because he was still incarcerated. This was the first time he had been able to visit. He stood at her headstone, which read Sarah Mitchell, beloved mother, daughter, and wife. He placed flowers on the ground and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I tried to warn you. I tried to protect you. I failed." A part of James wanted to believe that Sarah would forgive him, but another part knew that forgiveness was too much to ask for when your mistake cost someone their life. The Department of Corrections made changes after Sarah's death. They implemented mandatory decontamination procedures for all incoming mail. They installed full-body scanners at every facility. They trained staff to recognize signs of fentanyl exposure. They partnered with health departments to provide Narcan in every housing unit. But these changes came too late for Sarah. They came too late for the 7 inmates who died before her. They came too late for the families who lost loved ones because an institution failed to acknowledge a crisis until it became impossible to ignore. Emma struggled through her teenage years. She saw a therapist regularly, but the trauma of losing her mother in such a horrific way stayed with her. She was angry at her father for getting arrested in the first place. She was angry at the prison for letting her mother die. She was angry at her mother for not listening when she was warned. Most of all, she was angry at the universe for taking away the one person who loved her unconditionally. When Emma turned 18, she reached out to James. She didn't forgive him, she just wanted to understand. They met at a coffee shop and talked for 3 hours. James told her everything. Emma listened. At the end of the conversation, she said, "I don't know if I'll ever be okay with what happened, but I needed to hear your side." They didn't have a relationship after that meeting, but at least Emma had answers. The question that haunts everyone who knows this story is whether Sarah's death could have been prevented. The answer is absolutely yes. If the prison had taken the fentanyl crisis seriously from the beginning, contamination protocols would have been in place. If they had tested inmates who showed signs of exposure, James would have been identified and isolated. If they had warned visitors about the risks, Sarah would have known to be cautious. If they had banned physical contact temporarily until the crisis was under control, she never would have touched him. Every step of this tragedy was preventable. Every decision that led to Sarah's death was the result of institutional negligence. Sarah believed in redemption. She believed people could change. She believed love was stronger than mistakes. She died because the system she trusted to keep her safe failed. Her legacy should be a demand for better, a demand for transparency, a demand for safety, a demand that correctional facilities prioritize human life over institutional reputation. Sarah touched her husband because she loved him. That simple act of love should never have cost her life. Let me ask you, if you were in Sarah's position, would you have listened to the warning, or would you have believed love could overcome anything? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, hit the subscribe button, subscribe to Dark Motive Cases if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world, because we'll continue to share stories that matter, stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths, stories that remind us why we must demand better from the systems that hold power over people's lives.